everyone, and welcome back to Beyond Reality, where we dive into the exciting intersections of virtual reality, rehabilitation, and mental health. Today's episode is going to explore a topic that's deeply important and often misunderstood: PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. We're looking at how VR therapy is emerging as a groundbreaking tool in PTSD treatment, specifically focusing on how it helps rewire the brain and break those persistent cycles of trauma. For many listeners, it may be surprising to learn that VR, which is so often associated with gaming or even physical therapy, is actually being used in mental health and trauma recovery. Joining me today is my insightful co-host, Claire Ashbourne, who has done extensive research and hands-on work with VR therapy for PTSD. Claire, it's great to have you here.
Thank you, Bree. I'm really excited to talk about this. PTSD affects millions of people, and VR therapy is opening up new doors that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. There's something profoundly promising in how VR allows people to confront and process trauma in a new and accessible way, offering a fresh path to recovery.
I agree. So let's dive into this subject with a bit of background, Claire. Can you give us an overview of what PTSD is, how it affects people's lives, and why it's such a challenging condition to treat?
PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, often develops after a person experiences or witnesses a traumatic event, and it can range from events like military combat to personal traumas like accidents or assault. What makes PTSD particularly challenging is that the brain essentially struggles to process and store these traumatic memories in a healthy way. Instead of becoming a part of the past, these memories are almost trapped, leading to recurrent intense flashbacks and physical symptoms when something triggers that memory. This loop of trauma, anxiety, and avoidance is especially hard to break because the brain gets stuck in survival mode, overreacting to non-threatening situations as if they're dangerous.
Thank you for the explanation, Claire, and I think it helps us understand why PTSD can be so debilitating. It's as if the brain's fear response is on a constant loop, which can make daily life incredibly hard. Traditional methods like talk therapy or even medications aim to address this, but they don't always break that feedback loop on a neurological level. In fact, studies from the American Psychological Association shows that while cognitive behavioral therapy and prolonged exposure therapy are effective, up to 30% of people with PTSD remain unresponsive to these treatments. This is where VR therapy comes in, offering an alternative by actually helping people rewire their brain's response to those traumatic memories in a controlled environment.
Exactly, and that's one reason why VR therapy is so promising. Through VR, we can replicate elements of those traumatic experiences in a controlled, therapeutic setting, allowing patients to safely confront and process their fears. For instance, a study conducted by Rizzo on veterans with PTSD showed that VR exposure therapy significantly reduced PTSD symptoms, particularly when combined with clinician guidance. This approach works because over time, the brain learns to associate those memories with a more neutral response rather than an intense fear reaction, thanks to the safe repetition and gradual exposure that VR enables.
You mentioned how it helps rewire the brain's response to trauma. Can you explain how that works on a neurological level?
Sure. So VR therapy leverages neuroplasticity, which is the brain's capacity to form and reorganize synaptic connections, especially in response to learning or experience. For someone with PTSD, the trauma can create hyperreactive neural pathways, particularly in areas like the amygdala, which handles fear responses, and the hippocampus, which plays a role in memory processing. In VR therapy, patients are gradually exposed to trauma-related scenarios in a safe, immersive setting. Over time, this controlled exposure helps to desensitize the brain's response to these triggers, helping the brain to associate the memories with reduced fear and stress responses.
That makes so much sense, Claire. And it sounds like VR therapy doesn't just help people cope with their trauma, it actually allows them to rewire their responses on a physical level. A paper by DeFede and Hoffman found that VR exposure therapy for patients with PTSD after the 9/11 attacks showed remarkable reductions in PTSD symptoms. The immersive environment of VR provided these patients with a therapeutic setting where they could reprocess their trauma without the immediate risks associated with real-life exposure. The research noted that patients could work through scenarios step by step, beginning with mild triggers and progressing to more intense ones, which allowed their brains to gradually recalibrate their responses.
Exactly. This graded exposure is critical, and what's more, VR therapy allows the therapist to monitor physiological responses, like heart rate, to gauge how a patient is responding in real time. For instance, studies by Rothbaum have shown that with repeated VR exposure, the brain begins to shift its reactions, physiologically and emotionally, by creating new associations with the once feared stimuli. This helps patients dissociate trauma from their intense emotional reactions, a shift that traditional therapy might struggle to achieve without the immersive element that VR brings.
Let's bring this down to real-world examples. Claire, can you share some specific case studies or research done on how VR therapy has impacted PTSD?
Of course, Dr. Albert Rizzo's comes to mind. He is pioneering research on VR therapy for PTSD and has produced some compelling results, especially with veterans struggling to recover from combat-related trauma. In one of his well-documented studies, veterans were immersed in carefully designed virtual combat scenarios that replicated the sights and sounds of their experiences, but with the critical difference of being under their therapist's control. Dr. Rizzo's team would start with low-intensity exposures, like distant helicopter sounds or a quiet base camp scene, to gradually reintroduce sensory elements associated with their trauma. Over time, and as veterans became more comfortable, they were introduced to more vivid scenarios that simulated real aspects of combat.
That's fascinating, Claire. I've read about Dr. Rizzo's work as well, and it's remarkable how he combines sensory emotion with real-time adaptation, tailoring each experience to meet the patient where they are emotionally. What's truly inspiring about these cases is how veterans are able to confront the trauma directly in the virtual environment. By gradually working through these VR scenarios, they confront the core of their trauma in a way that's controlled and measured, without the risk of immediate overwhelm that can sometimes occur in traditional talk therapy. This ability to face their past while knowing they're in a safe space is so transformative. I imagine that for many veterans who often feel a lingering sense of alertness or hypervigilance, the process of regaining control over those memories must be life-changing.
Absolutely. And by the end of Dr. Rizzo's VR therapy sessions, many veterans report significant decreases in nightmares, flashbacks, and hypervigilance. For example, one study published from Dr. Rizzo's work found that veterans who underwent VR exposure therapy showed measurable reductions in PTSD symptoms, with several participants noting improved comfort in public spaces and decreased anxiety. This aligns with findings from a 2020 meta-analysis by Mark Powers and Paul Emmelkamp, which demonstrated that VR therapy can lead to sustained reductions in anxiety and improvements in emotional regulation. What's truly compelling about Dr. Rizzo's work is that it doesn't just provide temporary relief, it helps facilitate long-term changes in how the brain responds to traumatic memories and triggers, fundamentally reshaping the veteran's emotional responses and daily lives.
Dr. Rizzo's work makes the science feel personal and hopeful. I recently came across a fascinating research paper myself by Dr. Barbara Rothbaum titled, "You Can Do That? Feasibility of Virtual Reality Exposure Therapy in the Treatment of PTSD Due to Military Sexual Trauma." This study explores how VR therapy can be effectively used to help individuals with PTSD resulting from military sexual trauma. Dr. Rothbaum's research specifically looks at how VR exposure therapy helps patients confront environments and situations that they previously found overwhelming due to trauma. In her study, Dr. Rothbaum introduced participants to virtual scenarios that gradually increased in intensity and mirrored real-life triggers, allowing them to confront and process their fears in a safe and controlled environment. One participant, for example, had struggled with intense anxiety around certain military-related settings and experienced a high level of hypervigilance even in her day-to-day life. Through VR therapy, she was able to start with low-stress virtual environments that mimic those settings, gradually working up to more realistic scenarios that helped her regain a sense of control over her responses.
I read Dr. Rothbaum's research as well, and it is groundbreaking. It shows that VR can also offer trauma survivors a structured way to confront deeply embedded fears related to military sexual trauma. The virtual scenarios allowed participants to immerse themselves in environments they had been avoiding, all while feeling safe within the controlled VR space. Over several sessions, the therapy helped them reassociate these environments with a neutral or even calm response. By the end of the VR treatment, many participants reported feeling less triggered and more confident in situations that once caused intense anxiety. Dr. Rothbaum's work provides compelling evidence that VR exposure therapy can be a powerful tool in helping survivors reclaim spaces and experiences that trauma had previously made inaccessible.
Thank you for including that. It is so important for people to realize the impact VR can have for those suffering with PTSD from sexual assault as well. As we look ahead, Claire, where do you see VR therapy going in terms of PTSD treatment? What advancements might be on the horizon?
I think VR therapy is poised for transformative advancements. One exciting area is haptic feedback, which could allow patients to feel objects within the VR environment. This kind of sensory immersion would enhance the realism, making exposure therapy even more effective. Imagine, for example, a survivor of assault being able to touch or interact with their surroundings in a way that builds confidence and resilience. Additionally, more sophisticated AI could soon enable VR therapy to analyze vocal stress markers and facial expressions, providing an even more tailored experience.
That sounds incredibly promising, Claire. With haptic feedback and AI-driven customization, VR therapy would essentially create a fully immersive and responsive therapeutic environment. This could not only improve outcomes, but also expand access to PTSD treatment for those who might otherwise lack resources. If these tools become more affordable and accessible, VR could help countless people worldwide. Thank you so much, Claire, for sharing your insights with us today. This has been an incredibly enlightening conversation, and I think we've given listeners a lot to think about when it comes to what VR can offer in mental health and trauma recovery.
Thank you, Brianna. It's been a pleasure to dive into this discussion, and I really hope our listeners feel inspired to learn more about the potential of VR therapy in addressing PTSD.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us on Beyond Reality. If you or someone you know is interested in learning more about VR therapy for PTSD, we encourage you to explore resources like Neuro Rehab VR. Breaking the cycle of PTSD is challenging, but with new tools and the support of compassionate professionals, healing is within reach.